Happy Easter, everyone, even though I recorded this the day before. As usual, today we talk about the Catholic heritage of England of old. Usually during the Eastertide, I used to pick one European country and prepare a video about its Catholic identity and roots. Today we talk about the English Catholic tradition. I think it's extremely important to talk about this for the reasons we will have ample chance to discuss today, and just as a warm-up, because we can make tons of videos like this, as a matter of fact. Given the role of England in today's world, the issues that Britain suffered, mostly because of identity issues, we all very know well of that saddens us, but also should make us hopeful about still a possible revival of traditional identity. There is also the question of what are the actual roots of Britain in as you know, there are some heathens that basically claim that it's all about, the old North Sea kind of Germanic legacy, also in pre-Christian spiritual essence, and we explained countless times on Schwerpunkt how Catholicism is something that predates Christianity, as a matter of fact. Today, admittedly, we will be focusing on Christianity, so we'll talk about Catholicism in a more strictly Christian sense. I know that some people are confused about this, but surely we will observe, also as we've made in other videos, talking about the evangelization of England proper, not just of Britain, the extraordinary success of the Roman mission, the relationship between Bretwalda and Christianity. They are all deeply imperial, traditional topics, as a matter of fact, and that can't simply be left aside, right? So when we talk about England, if we're talking strictly about ancestry, you can go back to Jutland and see how all those peoples had, of course, interacted with the empire, what kind of idea of Catholic power exists within Aldenism and more. We also made some videos about the sort of Anglo-Saxon warfare from a spiritual standpoint. We did it mostly for a more general Germanic background, etc. So it's not a topic that we are new to. It was one of the earliest topics in Schwerpunkt, and among the various sort of elements that we point out in this is that, in fact, Aldenism, and those who held properly that elite level of properly the concept of leadership, were actually the ones who held more Apollonian roles of leadership in societies that were already very sort of stratified. Here we are in Northern Europe, so obviously things were relatively less than Gaul or Spain of Italy, etc. But these are the same elites that essentially convert the quickest to Christianity. Namely, Aldenist England is short-lived in formal official terms, and even when, of course, pre-Christian cults persisted, and they always did, also in those other parts of Europe for that matter, they were already framed before Christianity under a Catholic concept, and divides that were often also between truly an Apollonian elite and a essentially chthonic undergrowth, so to say. And there are some differences that are heightened eventually down the line of British history with the Norman conquest, etc. But it's important to appreciate the incredibly quick civilization that the Anglo-Saxons, later also the Anglo-Danes, obviously to an extent, because we could make the same identical point for that, underwent as soon, not just as they settled in Britain, but as they stepped up as one of the most successful peoples in the history of mankind. It took a while before they took off in a truly sort of commanding sense, but already England at the peak of medieval civilization was a might to reckon with. And regardless of the gap that existed at a point between the 15th and 17th century with continental development, it rose up once again as a great power, and on the same basis of Catholic traditional history. In fact, we could make this Catholic traditional content starting from before the arrival of Christianity itself. We can talk about this also for Britain, for properly the Celtic peoples that dwell in the island. However, we'll mostly stick for Eastertide to Catholicism in a Christian key, which is also, say, the one that I will not digress more along this path, because in general, one could make the case that, of course, there is a different relation between the fringe of Europe and where the great Apollonian empires had lorded over, and also what kind of, in fact, admiration the fringe had towards that, even when making counterculture. And in fact, it was specifically the elites that made the quickest change, that was not, in fact, a matter of conquest, but of deliberate local decision, right? And that's the point I was finishing before. We have a pretty big playlist about the evangelization of Europe, and I have more content like this incoming. All right, but you can't go as far as saying that indeed also the Celts had their own way to Catholicism, and not just, again, as Christians later on, right? That even predates, as you know, the English one in Britain and in Ireland. In any case, these premises are very much required in today's social media space, because people sometimes watch my videos and haven't the palest idea of what I'm talking about, simply because they don't have the time and patience to go look at literally the hundreds of videos we made on these very same topics. And this can be a disclaimer, like if you're not interested, if you have different ideas or whatever, like it's on you. Like here we make, I think, decent history, but if you think that history is just a mechanistic copy of certain sources or some otherwise detached personal opinion without backing that with an overwhelming amount of evidence, well, you may not like my channel, because that's going to steamroll basically everything that you can produce. In any case, the English Catholic tradition possesses roots that obviously extend. I will be saying very notorious things, like this is meant to be a simple video after all. Roots that extend to the Christian communities established in Roman Britain during the closing phases of imperial control in the late 4th century, when Christianity had already gained notable traction among Romano-Brittonic elites, following Emperor Constantine's conversion in 1312 and the Edict of Milan in 1313 that legalized the faith empire-wide, with Brittonic bishops such as Eborius of York, Restitutus of London, and Adelphius attending the Council of Arles in 314, in evidence of Christian symbols like the hero appearing in villas and artifacts at sites including Hinton St. Mary and Lullingstone. So as far as the establishment was concerned, and obviously also a large part of the population, Romano-Brittonic Britain, so England to be, was Christian, and would in many ways remain Christian even throughout the Anglo-Saxon settlement, regardless of the displacement of large part of the local population towards the west, in order sort of the destruction of much of the sort of local civilization due to things actually that happened before the Anglo-Saxon settlement, which was something that we can't really trace well from a strictly historical point of view, but archaeologically we know that something very ugly happened when the Romans left, all right, and the Romano-Britons were there on their own, and they couldn't basically handle the system anymore. And we know of fields being redrawn, of properties in this sense being seized. We see lots of very dreadful things that would also facilitate, in fact, the Anglo-Saxon takeover, which was as swift as effective. I will not digress on when we think that Christianity spread first to Britain. As far as we're concerned, in the 1st century, there would have already been some Christian. But at which point Christianity in the 4th century had secured official recognition throughout the empire that was properly a Catholic empire in the also pre-Christian sense. And so this decision was not merely a provincial one, right? And we explain in other videos, essentially in many other videos, how the spread of Christianity technically happened, which was far from merely a matter of sort of the dispossessed. The simplistic reductions vary from the terrible elites that had gone queer to, the sort of lesser people, the Fourth Estate that wanted to cause a Bolshevik revolution. Naturally, we don't take these things to any historical degree of seriousness. However, you have to picture in this sense also what the empire really meant in a already ecumenic sense, and so what role the church eventually had in taking over some specific aspects of the not just the spiritual but also the secular world, and especially in this sense, paradoxically, in pre-English Britain, as far as the establishment of what will be reaffirmed by the Roman mission between the 6th and the 7th century, properly the pattern of ecclesiastical administration that characterizes all of Europe, except basically, all of, the even beyond, what will remain Catholic Europe, even though Catholicism, as you understand, is not a confessional, it's the official name, even of the Orthodox Church for that matter, still today. But again, if you don't know what Catholic means, go check it out in my videos themselves. Had contemplated, in fact, like the idea of the city, the local district, and so the diocese in the city, right? Especially with the legalization of Christianity in a broader administrative form, and so an episcopal power that split essentially represented the sacerdotal dimension as opposed to the imperial one. This is the issue that will create the investiture controversy, the clashes between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. But actually, this is very underrated as a concept. In the Middle Ages, nobody really thought it was a real opposition between the two things. It was mostly a debate over who had the upper hand over the other, and which prerogatives fell in the hands of whom. Nobody really felt like there could be something, either the papacy or the empire standing alone. For some reason, people think that is the case. Also because they tend, in the wake, especially of the aforementioned sort of complete fiction about the nature of Christianity, that Christianity was something alien to the empire, essentially declaring complete ignorance in the concept of the mother church as the great mother, properly possessed and transfigured by imperial power, by the virile hero, which is at the root of all Indo-European identity, right? And that had never, in fact, been disjointed from one another. So much so that you can easily find the same imagery, the same concepts, Mary and the child, even with Frid and Balder, and etc. So it's not really a matter of debate in strict history of religion. Now, by late antiquity, Christianity had thus secured official recognition throughout the empire in a functioning hierarchy of bishops and priests directed worship, frequently adapting former pre-Christian shrines to the current purposes while integrating elements of Romano-Brittonic society into the life of the faith. Right? This video is not an encyclopedia of what was actually happening, especially the relation with the pre-Christian shrines can vary from full integration to brutal distraction. We know this, but in fact, it's never like the latter end is never so absolute. There's mostly a superimposition, right? And actually a flowing on the same concepts and the same symbols, etc., in the same Christian, in fact, Catholic tradition that spoke, in that sense, the same identical language that every culture out there had ever spoken regarding the ultimate point of how to achieve divinity and which factors played into that, the Trinity, etc. I'm not going to digress on this because I make so many videos about it that, again, if you have any problem with this concept, like, check those videos out. This is not the best one to get it, right? But I will routinely here refer to the issue as we point out certain dynamics, because it's more about their interpretation that we care than the obvious description here we're given to the notorious history, in fact, of the Christianization of Britain. Now, the dissolution of Roman administrative structures in the 5th century, coupled with the influx of Germanic Anglo-Saxon groups who imposed their so-called politistic, again, I will not use terms like pagan, like polytheism, because frankly, they do not have any meaning in the history of religion anymore, at least if you are worth anything as a historian of religion. First of all, the term pagan is not even wrong in the way even those Apollonian elites would have seen properly the pagenses, and so sort of lesser people from the lower strata of society that indulge normally in the most chtonically loaded superstitions as cults that sort of disgusted, obviously, the elite and the most heroic, enlightened ones. But pagan specifically was a term applied by Christians, as you know. As far as polytheism, it doesn't make any sense. It's a modern term, and it does not essentially encapsulate the sense of unity, of holistic, hypostatic unity of the world that is proper of Catholic tradition way before Christianity, right? Odin is, as you know, as Jupiter. We've made lots of videos describing how properly unitary these creeds were. If you check out my video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, you will basically learn that the entirety of Europe practically was dotted from Roman times and before with shrines in correspondence with specific rocks, heights, alpid, etc., to the sun god, right, the sky father. And this was particularly uniform. And what we see in evangelization is the complete overlap of Christian shrines with the same places. But this is the single most important thing. The same identical concept regarding the nature of those heights being preserved within the same Christian theology. And not because this was, quote unquote, copied from what existed before, it simply flowed into it, but because the same Christianity, of course, also from the Semitic background, had actually the same identical images, right? The sacred oak of the world is present everywhere. This is not just an Indo-European thing. Germans, Romans had it, the Jews had it. So again, I'm not even entering this, but just for telling you how the concept of polytheism as opposed to monotheism is a complete misconception of how divinity was seen in ancient times, including the so-called monotheistic religions. I mean, if you read the Old Testament, you're perfectly aware of the fact that there are multiple deities described, and that these were essentially the same idea of heroes and fallen powers that sort of are consistent with the entirety of universal tradition. So back in time. So the fact that we are so modernized and secularized in thought to make this radical and at the end of the day anti-traditional distinction between these cultures as some sort of categorically distinct sort of worldviews is probably the greatest mistake you can make at this point in religious history research. Even though, again, some people don't care about this, I'm sure that you talk to some historians of religions, they're completely unaware of the ultimate bottom line, because if you don't study really religions in comparison and in diachrony, it's a bit difficult to even just notice this fact. And there is also, this is the thing that actually bothers me the most, is that the main reason why people don't know this, it's actually anti-traditional bias. The people that want to pick quote-unquote tradition actually reason through modernistic and secularistic terms and have literally no clue about, in this sense, what we mean by tradition. They think it's some vague conservative idea of a set of strange morals that could have been flexible. No. All right? It's a radically absolute metaphysical concept informing the entire theology in history and that we are aware of. So if one wants to remain stuck in the last couple of hundred years of history where this was purposely dismantled and erased, their deal, right? Here we take a completely different perspective. And so the Anglo-Saxons and the poor youths that I always want to remember, nobody cares about them, but they were there. They spread their cults. These were militarized peoples, warlike tribes. They did that for a living, for survival to begin with. And they brought their cults across large stretches of, especially the eastern and southern territories of Britain. They dominated, dismantled much of the earlier ecclesiastical framework in those zones that in many ways had already suffered a pretty strong hit, again, in the previous generations, in all the turmoils that are actually conducive to the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Although resilient pockets of Christian observance continued to exist, especially in more western locales, including parts of Gloucestershire and Somerset, we stick to England particularly, where communities maintained continuity amid the broader disruptions. We made a video years ago, this is also notorious, that sort of before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, you have a pretty strong concentration of crosses, of heroes, etc., in essentially what will become England. And then, as the Anglo-Saxons arrived for a while, you had, and interestingly enough, and basically nothing in the West, in places like Wales or Cornwall, right? Then, when the Anglo-Saxons arrive, you start, the crosses largely disappear from England, for proper England at this point, and actually, the Celtic fringe receives this very intense amount of Christian symbols. Right, you want to appreciate that. We've made lots of videos about the Celtic fringe, about the Scots, about the Picts, and those had been the countercultural fringe within Britain. And at this point, they basically take in all these refugee elites that actually add prestige, aristocratically wise, to their cause, and especially in the common struggle against the Anglo-Saxons that will remain. In fact, also think about the Arthurian legend, a hallmark of Albionic tradition, interestingly enough. And there is a very radical Roman legacy, as you know, also in Welsh in nationalism, independentism, legions, and so on. We have to talk more about Welsh history. Today is not the case, unless we consider, of course, the post-13th century, where Wales was Kingdom of England, at least. Now, the renewed evangelization of the Anglo-Saxon realms gathered momentum from the closing years of the 6th century. So it's actually a pretty narrow window that the Anglo-Saxons stay so-called pagan, or heathen would be a better term, in Britain, right? And the pattern that takes place and is very characteristic of the Anglo-Saxons is the following. One king at a certain point, from the so-called Heptarchy, many other rulers, and this even in the absence of sources we can't understand on a smaller scale, converts to Christianity because of the reasons we will see now. Then his brother kills him because he also wanted to establish some kind of proto-dynasty, linear succession, because there is a power concentration in the process with ecclesiastical administration, etc. This guy dies in battle, and in this sense, also the former Christian king becomes a martyr, and the next king in charge is Christian, and they remain Christian. This is basically in great lines the history of evangelization, not just of England, but also Europe as a whole, right? And there isn't much, in fact, of a strong resistance at all to Christianization in these cases. Christianization of Europe at large, especially of the more relevant places, didn't look anything like the Saxon wars of Charlemagne, right? That are not much an exception that confirms the rule, but it's mostly like, the Franks wanted to conquer the freaking Saxons. Also, regardless of Christianity, obviously was baked into it as a whole, but there were much more stringent political and strategic reasons and practicalities for that to happen. And I would say the Saxons earned something in the process as well, but that will be for another video. This is very interesting, though, because it's not just a joke. Like, you could think like the Roman Empire ends, the Carolingian Empire ends, these terribly oppressed people that would sort of get rid of Christianity. Actually, they become the champions of Christianity and of, in fact, imperial Catholic power, other than just tradition as well. And this should actually tell you something about it, and the fact that some of the most successful peoples in Europe had historically been the ones who had resisted the most Christianity and actually ended up championing it and obtaining some of the highest results under the cross. In any case, I would say from especially a cultural point of view, this is the case of England. I think that there is a very powerful, inspiring, beautiful, poetic way to English Catholicism that is very unique. Every country has its own. And you can find it even in some aspects of pop culture. Think about Tolkien's idea of providence, with which I actually strongly disagree, because I think it's strongly influenced by a Protestant idea of grace at the end of the day. And that's unfortunately what insular perspectives cause. But I mean, there is something truly inspiring about Anglo-Saxon commonality, rights, identity. And in many ways, England was truly forged as a unitary country under the cross and against the enemies of the cross. This is very interestingly enough, while, again, all what had been the military religious ethos, military spiritual ethos of Catholicism, also in pre-Christian times, was actually living very strongly in sort of the Anglo-Saxon, also the later Anglo-Danish culture, like power and so on. So again, never make the silly mistake of cutting your sort of interest in a country if you come from specific sort of backgrounds just because at some point it became Christian. It's pretty dumb. Obviously, you must study what happened in Christian times. Also, if you're interested, obviously, in pre-Christian times, it's unavoidable. So be very careful in sort of taking as a joke 2,000 years of history, especially of European history, like what happened in them. Christianity is not really an option you can't dodge. Now, the renewed evangelization, as we were saying before, of the Anglo-Saxons realms gathered momentum from the closing years of the 6th century, advanced along two primary avenues that together forged lasting bonds with the broader Western Church centered on Rome. It's really typical of the evangelization of England, as much as other places at this time, mostly in Central Europe, led from Rome. That is to say, the incredibly meticulous connection between Rome and the missionaries operating in this fringe, where every single initiative was properly examined by the papacy. It was, for not even talking here, obviously, the immense cultural, civilizational legacy from a place like Rome across Europe. Essentially, Romanization has not stopped going, right? The spread of literacy together with Christianity, something that actually had began throughout the same Roman conquest of places like Gaul and Britain. Literacy spread, always remember, in Europe as a whole, in the broader Europe, from Italy, not from Hellas, as a matter of fact. In fact, the Byzantines were not particularly successful compared to the papacy at this time. We've had lots of videos on this. What is also very interesting is the Merovingian medium, right? It's not much that, especially some of the southeasternmost Anglo-Saxon, if we're talking about the Kentish in particular, the first Brett Valta as well, as you know, this thing was basically cyclical or serpentine across the entire Heptarchy, were clients of Frankish power. So much so that actually some Anglo-Saxons had migrated from the same goal in places like Normandy, where the Vikings would settle later, and you know the Normans will in fact invade England once again later, because as you know, and this was true also in Britain, as a matter of fact, the Saxons had already, through their piratic activities, settled here and there in Roman territory. In fact, many of the Britons that were displaced by the Anglo-Saxons were themselves, minoritarily speaking, also of Germanic ancestry for that matter. They had Romanized and already Christianized for that matter. Now, in the southeast, the papal initiative of Gregory I dispatched a contingent of roughly 40 missionaries, headed by the Benedictine monk Augustine, who reached Kent in 597. This Gregorian mission that we made multiple videos on, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, who had been inspired by seeing fair-haired Anglo-Saxon slaves, allegedly, like in Rome. This story famously remarked them, they were not Angles but angels, right? Was aided by the existing Christian influence on the Merovingian Frankish queen Bertha, consort to King Ethelbert, allowing Augustine to obtain the ruler's baptism, fix his metropolitan see at Canterbury, and commence the erection of churches, many deliberately sited upon pre-Christian sacred locations, as we were recounting before, thereby instituting an enduring jurisdictional connection to the apostolic see that would characterize English Catholicism across subsequent epochs and sustain its identity through periods of both flourishing and adversity. We know that this was in parallel, had already been happening, telling the truth, as you know, in the Celtic French that got Christianized very much sui generis, as you know, because properly there is a Gaelic tradition, also administrative model, mostly based on monasteries rather than dioceses. And England will actually absorb some of it, as you know. In English Catholicism, abbeys have stronger power than in the rest of Latin Christendom, but again, it's the same thing eventually. In all this, it's the Anglo-Saxons that do it. All right, there isn't a sort of threat, an imminent, like, I don't know, Frankish invasion, whatever. It's the Anglo-Saxon establishment that realize, obviously, that they very much need this type of stepping up in properly the concept of power, stabilization of the same, concentration, territorialization. These were all novelties in the migration era. Every single people that moved from the Barbaricum, that had very different forms of settlement, right, of demographic dynamics, of political, mostly instability, heightened warfare, etc. Once settling in properly the great developed regions of Western Europe, changed immediately, ipso facto, even without sort of choosing it, their own politics, their way of life. This is very easily and transversely documentable across all Western Europe. We will make more videos again about early Christianity and the evangelization of these regions. Right, what was happening in the Celtic French is also pretty much the same. Those mounds under which or in which that were, as we were saying before, the same mont's job is the same concept of Montjoie Saint-Denis, the aforementioned hilltops, etc. Where Gaelic heroes were buried, gradually became essentially seat of local, not just Christian shrines, but also proper saints that derived exactly from the same concept of sainthood, of Catholic sainthood, of pre-Christian tradition in the Gaelic world. Right, it was achieved again by these men that had owned both imperial, so to say, and sacerdotal power, right, warrior and priestly power. That with the great exhaustion of the common era all across the world, witnesses to a split, right, just like the church and the empire, or going through otherwise a deep crisis, right? Other cultures tried to do something like in the older model, they failed, right? So this was more like a repartition of power, not a and with a very vivacious dialectic, by the way, if not competition and conflictuality between the two elements that, however, worked brilliantly in boosting Western civilization in the Middle Ages to be, in fact, the dominant one in Western Eurasia and the Mediterranean. Now, concurrently, missionary endeavors in the northern kingdoms relied upon, in fact, the monastic traditions cultivated in Ireland and Scotland. Monastic because they weren't cities. It's as simple as it gets. The Celtic French was not urbanized, had not been consistently controlled by the Romans, who weren't properly the preconditions for that level of surplus organization, but they had themselves developed something, and so they didn't have a secular clergy, essentially, as you would have in the Roman tradition administration. You have notoriously centers such as Iona dispatching figures like Aidan to establish the monastery at Lindisfarne during the 1630s, under the sponsorship of King Oswald of Northumbria. This current of influence propagated southward into Mercia and adjacent territories through the mid-7th century, fostering conversions among the ruling elites and their subjects while introducing distinctive monastic practices that enriched the overall landscape, even as they prompted later harmonization. Naturally, never underestimate in this sense the fact that the overwhelming push came from the south anyway, right across the channel, and there wasn't much of a divide, of an obstacle in that sense. It's simply civilizational influence also, in a very continuous sense. The coexistence of these streams produced an initial array of localized rites and observances that generated notable divergences between the Roman-oriented Latin customs introduced via the Gregorian enterprise and the distinctive usages preserved within Celtic spheres, encompassing variations in the reckoning of Easter procedures. I made a video about the 7th century Irish Easter controversy, and the distinct form of clerical tonsure observed by monks. Resolution came through the intervention of King Oswiu at the Synod of Whitby held in 664, where after deliberation on the respective arguments presented by both sides, the monarch elected to adhere to the Roman computation and practices. It could have gone differently, but there's also a set of hints that show you how the more advanced sort of system was preferred eventually for a reason, grounding the choice, in fact, in the superior authority attributed to the successors of St. Peter rather than those linked to St. Columba. Verdict influenced by debates involving figures like Bishop Coleman and Abbess Hilda that gradually drew Northumbria, and by extension, because that was, as you know, one of the most sort of primitive, but in this sense also earlier exposed from the Celtic French elements of the Anglo-Saxon world, of Anglia in particular, much of the English kingdoms into alignment with continental norms, and helped consolidate a unified ecclesiastical order under papal oversight. Today we talk mostly about church, so actually there are clashes, as we were saying before, that are being constantly fought between these kingdoms within the Anglo-Saxon world. There already has, by the way, an incredibly clear concept that whatever exists in the British Isles belongs to the Germanic stock, right? And so the development of the church goes in parallel with that sense of gradual English identity, like consolidating over the centuries. But initially, the clashes were really fierce, and we have, interestingly enough, literal battlefields. We will talk about this in our more normal battle videos reconstructed from primary sources that yield from the same side, on the same battlefields, about the same fallen, not much Christian crosses and Odin's crows, in forms especially of, shield decorated, were present pretty much everywhere in that sense. But in this sense, not against one another, but within both sides already, right? And the superimposition, again, of these ways to God are notorious, very well documented, also from an anthropological point of view in many other places. And in general, they tell you how gradually developing these lands really were, and how the religious discriminant, very much like it had been, in the issues between the Arians and the Catholics in the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms, was very much pretextual, right? They actually were strongly believing in these in their own faith, whichever it was, and of course there was also a great competition and properly change in worldview and worries and hatred and struggles and fueling the same wars. But in many ways, the religious problem per se was not the primary one, was not dominant, right? This is true also in the later eras. It's not like the Vikings attacked, the Carolingian Empire because they were Christian. Surely some Vikings were very happy of killing Christians, but many of them were also already Christian, by the way, by that point. And in general, there are much bigger international reasons why that was happening as a whole. So also overly emphasizing the religious struggle there is not probably, everything was religious, everything was deeply spiritual. It's really a fool who believes that the so-called wars of religion just started with the Crusades, where everything was a war of religion, just by Catholic tradition. All Indo-European tradition tells us that life is a war of religion, as a matter of fact. So these religious issues were very important, and in some cases dominant, but overall, right, the evangelization of England was not essentially explaining like the internal clashes, nor later clashes between Christian and still not Christian powers were fundamentally about that. If we're talking about Islam, that was something different because it had a much sort of more declaratively defined kind of religious phase. This is true also in here. Like Christians are much, in this sense, much more disciplined, administered, organized, etc. Simply because Christianity is emerging from the most developed parts of Europe at this point. And so in this sense, it's not like there wasn't another identity from the other side. These were different peoples, but in many ways, but they were just essentially like the fruit of a declension, essentially of a human decline since the fall that had taken sort of different form, languages, physiognomies, names, etc. that, however, at the root were essentially believing in the same concept. And this is also, in fact, what in the higher level brings to spontaneous conversions from the side of people that were the actual guys who were in military charge of the affairs. I mean, again, there was nobody that was forcing an Anglo-Saxon on the tip of this world to convert to Christianity, and not only just for that religious reason, if not other Anglo-Saxons. And so nobody really forced them to do so, to be so. Now, subsequent gatherings, including the Council of Hertford, convened in 673 under Archbishop Theodore of Tarsus. These are figures of the Levant, right, that also appear because of connections with the Byzantine Empire and also the actual refuge that many Easterners take in the West after the Islamic invasions, as a matter of fact. Advancing this trajectory by promulgating canons designed to foster consistency across dioceses and instituting provisions for recurrent assemblies of bishops at Clovso, while explicitly endorsing the priority of Latin traditions in districts where Celtic elements had earlier predominated, and thereby reducing regional disparities that had arisen from isolation. The resulting ecclesiastical architecture featured two principal provinces, the southern one anchored at Canterbury, with overarching primacy, and the northern at York, Eboracum, right? The legacy of Constantine is not to be sort of underplayed. Actually, at some point, some Anglo-Saxon king of the English will style himself not imperator but basileus at some point in the High Middle Ages. Therefore, telling you how there were admittedly connections, as you know, with the Byzantine Empire, also via Scandinavia, etc. And England was for a while sort of an Anglo-Danish country as well. But you have interesting competition, in fact, from other centers that wanted their own archiepiscopal see as well. For example, there was a temporary third one arranged at Lichfield in 787 through the initiative of King Otho of Mercia. That was a very powerful ruler, famous for his dike, but also for his mostly imperial policy. This was the period of Mercian hegemony. And Wu sought to diminish, in fact, the sway of the Kentish Metropolitan by securing greater autonomy for his own realm. The Kentish had arisen again as first, because historically those were essentially the most advanced parts of Britain, but they had not succeeded in sort of broader moral and political terms to gain the upper hand. Mercia in particular will at this point remain in charge for a while, and they will try to infiltrate, in fact, into the southeast from the center of England, trying to reduce the sort of the spiritual primacy, the prestige that, as we've seen before, Canterbury had essentially earned since the first Roman mission. This short-lived elevation of Lichfield, approved at the Synod of Chelsea with papal involvement from Hadrian I, endured only until 803, when it reverted to subordination under Canterbury at another synod, restoring the dual province structure that endured as a stable feature of the English Church. Diocesan administration centered upon bishops who resided in cathedral settlements and directed operations with the assistance of a clerical familia tasked with sacramental administration, instruction, and outreach to distant locales, supplemented by minsters that functioned as auxiliary hubs of pastoral and scholarly activity, where communities of clergy supported the bishop's mission. Minsters, as you know, is very important in early medieval English political power and territorial settlement, because they're fundamentally fortified monasteries. They're a very interesting settlement form around which, in fact, important centers were further developed. It's a bit like the boroughs in in coastal areas, and there are some analogies overlapping at the same. The parish framework developed as an extension of manorial organization, whereby proprietors constructed and sustained churches, exercised patronage in the appointment of priests, and derived support from tithes that transitioned from voluntary contributions to mandatory levies by the 10th century, thereby underwriting material requirements of local ministry and embedding the church deeply within the agrarian and social fabric of the kingdom. So you see that in this Northern European country you have some slightly less urban emphasis, more monastic and rural power, essentially some greater peasantry, again, probably common law-minded kind of community down to very local levels. Naturally, there are important cities and centers, but in many ways they resent themselves of their absolute and relative sort of smaller power compared to these other communities, as opposed to what we see, in fact, most of, especially again in the rest of Christian Europe. Monasteries emerged as the foundational institutions of religious life, manifesting in various configurations that encompassed both sexes communities, governed, for example, like female convents by abbesses, episcopally supervised assemblies of monks. So again, monastic power has an important control on secular clergy as well. Doesn't have the upper hand, but still, right? Normally in the rest of Christendom, the secular clergy and monks lived a bit separated from each other. Also didn't like very much one another because they were sort of carriers of different sort of experiences, culture, sort of mentality. And here the boundary is more blurred, but that same competition / antagonism does occur. You have establishments revolving around the married clergy and their households. For many places up to the 11th century, it was completely normal for clergy to be married. Royal and noble patronage frequently underwrote these foundations, which in turn cultivated centers of education, scriptoria, for the copying of texts. As you know, there's all a beautiful insular tradition in Britain, in Ireland, as far as properly script, paleographically, codicologically, there are beautiful illuminations. An organized relief for the needy, while also serving as repositories of learning and intercessory prayer that benefited both the living and the departed. Incursions by Viking forces during the 8th and 9th centuries wrought extensive devastation, simply because these monasteries were rich, right? So there were primary sort of motivation, obviously, for the Norse piratical activities was targeting these pretty fat centers. Above all, in northeastern districts, they were, in this sense, targeted not because they were the richer, but because actually they were the more vulnerable. The north was sort of more unstable in general, and in fact will be much more reinfiltrated at some point by some pre-Christian cults. In fact, there the reassertion of such Eden observances tied to deities, still including Odin and Thor, coinciding with the plunder and ruin of numerous monastic sites, diminishing resources and the quality of religious observance as a consequence. Again, creating a functional ecclesiastical administration was something particularly costly. Again, it worked mostly through mechanism of patronage, of foundation of these monasteries were for the sake of centralizing sort of towards concentrating power in a more dynastic direction. The local rulers tended to appoint also their children as abbots, abbesses, so that technically these were ecclesiastical properties. They had their immunities, their prerogatives, their rights, so they remain untouchable in theory, but there were in any case some private patrimony that the family could spend in that sense. So the Viking incursions, needless to say, hit what was growing, promising this an important ecclesiastical ministry that survived. But again, in this northern European world, like scarce surplus, especially in the north of England, this is a substantial structural damage. These raids, beginning notably with the sack of Lindisfarne in 793 and continuing with attacks on other vulnerable coastal houses, nevertheless saw the continuity, in fact, of the Archiepiscopal Office of York itself facilitate a comparatively rapid integration of Norse inhabitants into the Christian fold by the opening decades of the 10th century. It's also that idea that basically that if the Norse, as they had in certain cases, the upper hand in these places, would have simply been driven by sort of canceling Christianity, that didn't happen anyway. So again, why? Permitting, actually, in fact, ecclesiastical authorities to engage in diplomatic dealings with same Scandinavian chieftains that were quite interested in all of this, because that would have provided them with more power and thereby, in fact, stabilized the religious order while enabling English churchmen to assist in the conversion processes unfolding in mainland Scandinavia itself. Right? And in fact, indeed, Britain and Scandinavia are very linked at this point, not just because, in fact, the Anglo-Saxons were de facto southern Scandinavians from the Jutland Peninsula, but because, first of all, contacts also in the previous centuries, we made a video about this, had never really ended. But because, in general, the revival of European civilization, albeit slow in the North Sea, was obviously conducive to a more intense and sort of civilized connection at some point in the between the two sides, the two shores. Right? It's said that Knut the Great was one of the great kings of England, not just of Denmark. Norway. Now, the consolidation of a unified English kingdom, however, under the Western Saxon dynasty, had happened earlier. Right? It had been spearheaded by Alfred the Great, who also notoriously fought and won to an important extent, at least against the Vikings, and advanced by his descendants through resistance and reconquest, positioning the sovereign as both temporal ruler and a figure invested with sacred responsibilities as vicar of Christ within a Christian polity, with bishops often recruited from royal circles and presented at synods for approval. Alfred defended against Viking incursions and promoted learning by translating key texts and founding monasteries like those at Athelney and Shaftesbury, exemplified this fusion of royal and sacred roles. Episcopal selections commonly drew from the ranks of royal chaplains or reformed monastic communities and underwent formal presentation at synodal gatherings for clerical endorsement and consecration, whereas archbishops required direct papal approbation manifested through the bestowal of the pallium during journeys to Rome, that also entailed contributions such as Peter's pence arrangements that occasionally precipitated in diplomatic strains, yet underscoring the persistent link to the Holy See. This is an aspect that must never be forgotten in any case. The Saint Knut the Great, for example, went over to Rome at some point. It was a terrible bad Viking, but actually were already Christian. We've seen it also in the video about Harald Hardrada. And importantly enough, again, England is evidently, in fact, compared to Scandinavia, for example, a much more civilized, developed country, right? It has its own problems that especially are compounded by the sort of Norse destabilization of the kingdom. But in general, there is a continuous connection with a proper continental, Western, Roman, papal civilization, culture, world. Consider that Rome is still, at this point, not just considered the true holy city of the West. When you have pilgrims, even from as far as Iceland, going over to Jerusalem, they pass by Rome. What do you think they're more concerned with Jerusalem or with Rome? Jerusalem, they arrive there, they say, oh yeah, well, we saw the various places of the life of Passion of Christ, etc. And it's just a bit. And then when he described Rome, it's like, they never stop. It's immense. They're utterly amazed by that. Rome invested drastically the West with an overwhelming amount of literary development, statal models, administration, culture, art, everything possible, right? And in this sense, we should recover the notion that Northwestern Europe was deeply connected with Rome without virtually any fracture, right? The Anglo-Saxons, for a couple of generations, essentially created that in a virtual sense, but without any chance, you can argue, to prevent any of this flow to spread everywhere, as it happened pretty much all over also Northern and Eastern Europe, without any limit and without any attempt at stopping it in any meaningful way by anyone, right? That's an important aspect of the wall. Like, they would have converted anyway. Even those who fought, say, against the Carolingians or the Crusaders in the Baltic later, like, it was mostly a matter of being conquered by another people. Like, they would have converted to Christianity. If you think about the Lithuanians, they wouldn't convert until the 14th century. We're already befriending the papacy exactly to leverage the fact that we're not yet Christian, to say, okay, well, we'll Christianize if you help us here and there, always using that as a card, because they didn't have much other cards to play in that matter. So if you, again, don't see this in a real historical picture, you just nitpick your provincialistic obsession with this or that cultistic view, I don't think you can have anything meaningful to say about sort of history in general, where only the one of viewer only, it's basically mostly the one that by being known well, like, is enough to learn all the rest of the entirety of the world. In any case, here again, the connection with Rome, we can't really stress this enough. The familiarity, the unavoidable connection. By the close of the first millennium, the kingdom of the English, because this technically was the real name, England came like in the 12th, switching from the people to the land, something that mostly happened in the 12th century. It encompassed 18 dioceses distributed across the provinces, with archdeacons furnishing supplementary supervision to bishops in the oversight of parishes, and monasteries and yearly synods convening parish clergy at cathedrals for collective deliberation, discipline, and the promotion of uniformity. Before the Norman conquest, the Anglo-Danes were pretty advanced from an administrative point of view. They were surely the most advanced Northern European country at the time, and as you know, the same Normans will use much of their administrative system in general, like most of the ethno-cultural basis for like law, institutions. The Normans sort of established just some more concentrated power, obviously coming from more advanced systems actually from the Western Frankish world, but still perfectly integrating what was obviously not to eliminate from this country. The extensive reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, initiated by Edward the Confessor as a palatial monastic foundation patterned after continental Norman models, further accentuated the shifting gravitational center of national affairs towards London and highlighted the interplay between royal piety and architectural grandeur in the service of faith. This is also another very important aspects, again, regarding the institutional and administrative development of the Kingdom of the English by the time of William the Conqueror. The fact that London, Westminster, historically with its chancery, etc., was a much earlier and proper capital, center of power than Paris will become in relation to the Kingdom of France. Not that Paris was not important, it was less important. But in relative terms, like the idea that there is a unitary center of power and that this is also very much connected with the local clerical one, it's obvious, all right? The events of 1066, when William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel with explicit papal endorsement, it was a crusade, right, from Alexander II and the requirement that English clergy submit to his authority, inaugurated profound alterations, however, in the ecclesiastical sphere. Right, the reason of the crusade was vehemently political. It was endorsed in this sense what was understood as a Romano-Germanic conquest of essentially a still Germanic country, in the sense that the broader, in fact, Germanic world, if properly seen from a Latin, from a Romance perspective, was still understood as sort of barely civilized, right? And so all the good connections with Rome and the fact that indeed the English were Christian, or also the Norse that had blended themselves further in them. Still, in this political struggle of succession, there was a spiritual temper that was seen as, okay, like this stuff should not happen within Christianity, so those other guys are wrong and we will essentially launch a crusade against them. But it's interesting because indeed, you know that I don't like what ifs, but Hastings was, to say the least, a watershed of the May. Everything is a watershed if you want to see it, but one of the most important events that brought a new regime. And indeed, had that not happened, say, had the English gone on without Norman, Western Frankish conquest, they would have been a different country, needless to say, much closer to Scandinavia, culturally, politically, etc. And so we would have had a really very different history, to say the least. In any case, you have this papal endorsement of William from Alexander II, and the requirement that English clergy submit to his authority. The new monarch supplanted the bulk of Anglo-Saxon prelates with Norman and French appointees, even though, especially from the southernmost and so most developed parts of Britain, the Anglo-Danish establishment had basically let the Normans in. I mean, this is also often underplayed as an aspect, also marrying to one another, etc. Among these appointees from the continent, you have Lanfranc, that assumed the See of Canterbury. That is very symbolically punching. That's a war of conquest and of occupation. You have Thomas of Bayeux, acquiring the Archbishopric of York, while papal legates dispatched in 1070 conducted a symmetric review that removed clergy judged deficient in competence or moral standing, reducing the number of native bishops to merely 2 by the year's conclusion and aligning the hierarchy more closely with continental reform currents. This is also a very important aspect because, as we were saying before, like these countries were different from one another, and indeed, English Christianity at this point was, especially from a strictly disciplinary and organizational point of view, a bit more lax and loose, inefficient, right? Decaying. A bit like the same historical unity of a substantially English monarchy had been infiltrated by the Norse that had brought in a sort of more oligarchic but also privatized system. So this is not new. Like, there were countries that were Christian but needed reform. It's a bit like, look at Bavaria before the age of Charlemagne. At some point, some of those priests couldn't even read Latin. So there was a broader reform of the English church along in strictly constitutive terms, coming with the Norman conquest. And this is also the age, of course, of reform in general. From the mid-11th century, as you know, the Church of Rome is heading ever more towards probably a papal monarchy. And so there is a need of adequacy and general, also better provincial control. Lanfranc was a key reformer. It centralized church administration, asserted Canterbury's primacy, and oversaw the rebuilding of many cathedrals in Romanesque style that was flourishing at the time, while integrating English practices with Norman ones. This is very interesting because eventually England will be the actual sort of spiritual and mystical birthplace of Gothic, right? Not much northern France. I mean, they were very close. The spread was pretty fast, but it was particularly in England that the particular idea of the Gothic was developed in the following centuries. And so this is very interesting because it shows how sort of some civilizational reboots are able to reinvigorate, even through foreign conquest of the local peoples. We're talking about that before for the continental Saxons. Although certain incoming clerics incorporated features of the antecedent Anglo-Danish arrangements into their governance, others transplanted usages prevalent in Normandy. Substantial territorial concessions to Norman religious houses spawned affiliated priories across the realm, integrating English monastic life more firmly into feudal obligations that linked land tenure to the provision of military support of the crown. Naturally, also, England had strongly clientelar bias. Again, generally speaking, in the last couple of centuries, the Anglo-Danish had become more, again, oligarchic and tendentially feudal, but what we call feudalism, quote unquote, and the vassalatic beneficiary system on the model of the West French in particular, was properly imported by the Normans into England. Cathedrals underwent comprehensive rebuilding programs in this period, many preserving or instituting monastic chapters consistent with established English conventions, even as new architectural styles and liturgical emphasis took hold. Successive waves of continental religious movements further diversified the institutional fabric and responded to evolving spiritual aspirations. The Cluniac observance attained vogue as direct Norman linkages attenuated, succeeded by the expeditious dissemination of Augustinian canons commencing in the initial decades of the 12th century and the subsequent penetration of Cistercian communities, whose rigorous interpretation of monastic discipline, emphasizing manual labor and simplicity, yielded monumental foundations, including revolt and fountains that became centers of economic activity as well as prayer. So the Norman conquest in many ways was properly a bridge, a gateway to further British uniformity with continental development. These are properly the centuries in which England is bridging the gap with post-Roman Europe, the rest of post-Roman Europe, and truly developing one of the greater powers of the same, interestingly enough. So it's a moment of rampant growth and development. If you're interested, obviously, in all these developments from a strictly ecclesiastical point of view, I made lots of videos about the Cluniac reform, the Cistercians. The Cistercians are really important because they specialize in land exploitation. They originated from Citeaux in 1098. It's not even that far away from England. Again, northern French influences had always been there. The Cistercians emphasized austerity and spread rapidly in England, with houses like Waverley as the first in 1128. The mendicant orders of Dominicans and Franciscans established footholds from the 1220s onward, concentrating their apostolate upon urban preaching and care for the populace in growing towns, where they exerted considerable influence on popular devotion and theological discourse, while the military religious orders of the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights secured holdings and integrated into pan-European networks dedicated to crusading endeavors and charitable enterprises that allowed English participants to engage with the wider Latin Christendom. If you're interested, I made a video about William Marshall. So if you have an idea of the character, you know why I'm advising that video to you. The aggregate of monastic establishments surpassed 600 by the early 13th century, although the tempo of fresh benefactions diminished thereafter, imposing sustained fiscal strains upon many communities and prompting adaptations in their management and endowments. Cistercians specialized also in war horses breeding for the Crusades. At this point, this is the age of Richard Lionheart. You have, again, a great deal of... I'm preparing, spoiler, a video on the so-called Angevin Empire, right? So if you want to glue this well with further understanding with the power that was emanating further, actually back from Britain into into France, like how deep the bridge really was between the two countries at this point. And here we're not even touching on all the rest. Like, think about the revival of the Arthurian Legion, the matter of Britain. And so this is actually one of the most unbelievable times in history, given the peak of European chivalry, mysticism, sort of crusading ideals, and so this renewed. Think about the Holy Grail and the relevance that this holds. In fact, also in insular tradition. Now, prelates continued to wield considerable worldly authority in their capacity as crown tenants, furnishing contingents of knights for royal campaigns, managing expensive demand that generated revenue for both church and realm, adjudicating disputes within their jurisdictions, and commencing in the 13th century occupying designated places in the House of Lords, alongside the superiors of the foremost abbeys and priories as the Lords Spiritual, so-called, thereby embedding ecclesiastical voices directly into the evolving mechanism of parliamentary governance and representation. This is particularly important in the same period of the Magna Carta and the properly English parliamentarism, pactism, and one that, as you know, this is also the era, as we'll see now, the struggle between Henry II and Thomas Becket, and in that regard also renewed international struggle between sort of papal control and local, also aspirations to more national ecclesiastical policy, as the king as essentially the head of the church in some sort of Caesar-papistic way of Byzantine influence. We've seen this, that as far as 1066 was concerned, Harald Hardrada in Norway had received that mentality also from his business services as a Varangian guardsman back in the day. So there was a way, like properly a mentality that was in Northwestern Europe had also inherited much of a previous idea of power, of control. You can argue that, yes, that more imperially loaded sense of, that had already been a matter of wrestling, an ongoing one in the continent as well, that the king, the regnum was superior, had to properly lord over the sacerdotium, as opposed to allowing a balance. It was a pretty intense thing. At this point, we're looking at Frederick Barbarossa in Italy against the papacy and the communes. So it's a pretty coherent mechanism, even connections, by the way, between England and Germany in that case. So there's a strong connection in any case between Northern Germany in particular, the Rhineland, England, almost as a legacy of, again, more of a Germanic European way to things that in fact brings, at this point in history, actually the two countries to develop in relative terms even more than, say, France or Italy, that were more advanced but were growing as a whole, as bigger systems, more slowly. So it's really a moment of deep experimentation, so as far as the ecclesiastical views were concerned. This meant, however, that the same English church was pretty combative. And in fact, this medieval epoch witnessed an intimate, albeit periodically adversarial, symbiosis between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the English monarchy, in which bishops and prominent abbots tendered counsel within the royal council, directed civic administration and revenue collection in urban centers, and at times assumed command in military crises, exemplified by Archbishop Thurston of York's mobilization of forces that repelled Scottish incursions at the Battle of the Standard in 1138, and demonstrated the fusion of spiritual and temporal leadership. That was actually a mean of imperial affirmation, inasmuch as we were saying before, actually the affirmation of England had historically happened against all the fringe of Celts, Norse, whatever they, and Anglo-Saxon dissidents for that matter, against properly a concept of monarchy that was imperial at the same time, was to hegemonize this island. Essentially, Scotland was hegemonized already by England, had been heavily anglicized, Normanized, especially in the lowlands, as you know. Thurston, unable to ride due to age, rallied Yorkshire forces under Saint's banners in a holy cause against the Scots, that were seen in turn within Britain as a sort of the barbarians, the imperfectly Christian, right? Just these stereotypes, as we've seen before, it's actually Scotland had been evangelized, surely compared to England now a bit imperfectly, but before the same Anglo-Saxons. But nevertheless, it's this idea that, if you are, who is the favorite here? Also in a strictly papal sense, when two Christian countries go at war in this, especially within Latin Christendom, like the papacy does take sides, tries obviously to stop the war, but there is also one side that is fundamentally endowed with a greater sort of cause, right? I've seen it in many different circumstances, but everybody uses the church with this self-promoting holy war justification and blessing, which was, again, this happened also at the time of Odin, right? It's not a Christian thing per se only. Recurrent conflicts concerning the nomination of bishops, the demarcation of jurisdictions, in particular, and monarchical meddling in church governance punctuated the period, reaching a notorious climax in the assassination of Archbishop Thomas Becket within Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 at the hands of knights responding to the expressed frustrations of Henry II. And this is also very interesting, the fact that there was a brutal enforcement. Obviously, there were some noblemen that were from the other side there, but the idea that, again, that the imperium here must rule over the sacerdotium is affirmed. Becket, who had clashed with the king over church rights, including clerical immunity from royal courts, was slain by 4 knights who interpreted Henry's angry outburst as a call to action, leading to his swift canonization and making Canterbury a major pilgrimage site, even sort of more than it had been before. Becket's prompt elevation to sainthood converted his burial place into one of the foremost pilgrimage foci in Western Europe, drawing devotees seeking intercession and contributing to the economic and spiritual vitality of the cathedral. A succession of archbishops encompassing Anselm, Stephen Langton, I made a video about, especially the former, endured banishment or detention while safeguarding ecclesiastical prerogatives against regal assertions. Yet the English Church had, by the outset of the 13th century, attained substantial autonomy in spiritual governance, directing its allegiance chiefly toward Rome, even as its leaders persisted in discharging essential secular obligations that included the administration of justice and the provision of counsel on matters of state. Here it would be important to digress on also the Magna Carta and the way John in particular saved his own reign. I believe that John of England actually was, contrary to popular opinion, one of the greatest, most capable rulers in English history. But part of the prejudice against him is not just like, the noblemen managed to score, the barons managed to score over him the Magna Carta, so to say, which also is not like a very good thing for England. Say it turned out to be a good thing because of how England eventually developed, but it was not uniquely because of it. In the moment, it deeply undermined monarchic power, as a matter of fact, and it was obviously the consequence of a defeat, and also of a defeat of Saint John. But as you know, John died undefeated at the end of the day, and part of this happened because he had, like most Western countries at that point, declared himself a vassal of the church. We're talking the age of Innocent III, so this is probably the peak of the Roman Catholic Church, and obviously, like the later anti-papistic propaganda was not particularly generous towards John. It also liked the idea of a bit of obsession for tyranny, at least in some institutional sense. That there is definitely an exaggeration in the Anglo-American world. Otherwise, thanks to the English route, like sort of provided, surely the world with a very peculiar and effective concept of liberty, but not without collateral effects in this sort of historical interpretation. Nevertheless, lay piety at this point manifested prominently through pilgrimages directed toward shrines linked with indigenous saints or sites formerly consecrated to pre-Christian rites, as we were saying before. It would be very interesting to stress how much continuity existed in this regard. There is also involvement in crusading ventures that excite the fantasies of the rulers of the time. They were all properly schooled, indoctrinated by the church. Like you can't have like a knight doing the things that he does, right? And I talked about knightly combat psychology last year. We'll come back on it. If you're not properly Christianized, you're not properly motivated in that regard, and also in the sense large assets and resources dedicated for the education of the same clergy, right? And as you know, the Crusades were conceptualized mostly as spiritual journeys, like a protracted form of pilgrimage that allowed participants to fulfill vows of penance while contributing to the defense of Christendom. In many ways, by the way, almost customized ad personam. English contingents figured conspicuously in the second, third, and fifth expeditions to the Holy Land. If you look at Richard Lionheart, if you look at Edward I, Longshanks, these are all sort of great crusading heroes, and you have many viewing the journey itself as an extension of devotional travel. Ecclesiastical architecture and decoration conveyed core teachings via polychrome murals that portrayed doctrines of creation, the incarnation, atonement, penance, purgatory, and eschatological judgment, complemented by rude screens that demarcated the sacred chancel from the nave, and by prominent crucifixes that underscored the distinction between ordained ministers and the faithful while inviting contemplation of Christ's sacrifice. The celebration of the Mass, conducted in Latin with the priests presenting the oblation of Christ's body and blood in accordance with the teachings of transubstantiation, constituted the devotional fulcrum. Obviously enough, congregants venerated the host at its elevation, a gesture widely believed to afford protection against untimely demise for the remainder of the day, which was a bit of a superstition. Admittedly, the meaning is something else, really, but it's definitely a high moment and therefore something that still today inspires you in that direction. While reception of communion occurred sparingly, predominantly at Easter, and solely in the species of bread, following sacramental confession and the imposition of penance that often involved acts of charity or pilgrimage. In the 14th century, intellectual currents at Oxford, articulated through the scholarship of John Wycliffe, leveled criticism against perceived clerical avarice, the mechanical character of much liturgical observance, and the undue immersion of senior churchmen in temporal administration, thereby stimulating the emergence of the Lollard tendency that maintained subterranean existence as a marginal grouping in the succeeding century, notwithstanding concerted efforts by bishops to interdict wandering preachers and to mandate the delivery of doctrinally sound sermons in parish settings. We talked about the Lollards in a video about how pacifism is essentially an anti-Catholic principle, and definitely this was a product of the 14th century crisis malaise. Like old Europe had this sort of subcultural movements, and we also read sort of the Lollards' points and whatever. It's mere populism. It's sort of lesser people not understanding obviously anything about theology for that matter either. And in fact, these Wycliffe's ideas emphasize Scripture's supremacy, but in the form just of however they wanted to personally interpret them, which is obviously a pretty idiotic concept, as well as challenging aspects like transubstantiation, which is like, you know, the basis of divine transcendence throughout all Christian and pre-Christian tradition. Good luck with that. Unsurprisingly influencing essentially a Protestant movement that persisted underground despite suppression. A modest Jewish enclave that had taken shape in the wake of the Norman arrival in particular encountered episodic outbreaks of violence, and gradually stringent statutory constraints culminating in its wholesale banishment from the realm. Famously enough, in 1290 under Edward I, we talk about this, reflecting the complex interplay of economic utility, royal protection, and periodic popular resentment within the broader Christian society. This was very common at the time because essentially the great medieval civilization was stalling a little bit. And after the massive expansion, these big countries needed money, and the Jews, it was actually a bit more complicated. These were different factions. This was mostly played by the same English. And as you know, this happens also in France, in other countries, and not just against the Jews. Wherever had the money could be seized. The Templars, the Lombards, right? But in England, this edict of expulsion of the Jews issued on July the 18th after Parliament of 1290, after parliamentary negotiations, by the way, tied to taxation amid rising Judenhass, including blood libels and debt-related tensions. That was actually the most important aspect of this war. Forced around 3,000 Jews to leave the country, marking the first permanent national expulsion in medieval Europe, interestingly enough. The medieval synthesis of faith and institutional life, distinguished by its unwavering communion with the See of Rome and its integration into the daily rhythms of English society, persisted without fundamental doctrinal fracture until the political exigencies of the 16th century intervened under the Tudor dynasty. And naturally, in a video about sort of Catholic England, we can't but sort of read the most painful aspects of its partial demise. Of course, there is a Catholic England still today, but we know how the story went, and in case you missed that, we will refresh it for you. Henry VIII's determination to secure an annulment of his union with Catherine of Aragon, as you know, the youngest child of the Spanish Reyes Catholicos, thwarted by the refusal of Pope Clement VII amid considerations, in fact, of imperial politics at the time, given the fact that the Habsburgs had entered at that point as heirs to the Iberian Union, induced the Reformation Parliament spanning 1529 to 1536 to legislate the severance of papal oversight. Yeah, we have never really made many videos about Henry VIII's reign. Again, we will start now to do more proper non-military. We talk about Tudors warfare, and so, but we will come back a bit more in the civil, quote-unquote, side of the story. But this is very notorious. Like, if you are British, aside from all the sort of butchering the English language, you will forgive me for having to repeat things that you know by heart. But the Act in Restraint of Appeals proclaimed England an autonomous empire governed by a single supreme head, the submission of the clergy, subordinating the framing of canon law to royal approval. This is big, right? And before we go on, I would simply, I think that the Anglican Reformation is by far, amidst all the things that happened to England in general, probably the worst that ever happened to the country. But I will also partially leave this on Easter to you, which is a great act of magnanimity for that matter. And the Act of Supremacy enacted in 1534, designating the monarch as supreme head, in fact, of the Church of England. Right? This was not the only country that would do that within the Reformation, but there were also Catholic countries that would push towards that. If you think about Gallicanism, in France you have something fairly similar, but not breaking with Rome. Thereby, in England, transferring authority over appointments, doctrine, and discipline into royal hands. Right? And I was talking just recently with a person that, I will skip the nationality, but it's part of the empire, part of the Commonwealth. And she told me that, she's Catholic for that matter. She's Anglo-Dutch, and she pointed out that, they made it sort of a religion of state with banners of England all inside the church. Although Henry himself upheld several long-standing teachings, including transubstantiation as affirmed in the 6 Articles of 1539 on pain of severe penalties, the systematic suppression of religious houses between 1536 and 1541, justified through visitations that highlighted alleged improprieties and financial irregularities, appropriated enormous ecclesiastical assets and territories, reallocating them predominantly to secular proprietors, and thereby effecting a lasting reconfiguration of the socio-economic fabric while diminishing the institutional presence of contemplative and charitable life. This was actually a disaster. It was actually a fruit of the general late medieval crisis. So the accusations of improprieties and financial irregularities they were obviously an excuse. I mean, there was no system that was not heavily corrupt. And at this point, actually, the best tribunal ever, this is very well established by historiography everywhere, was the Holy Inquisition, for that matter. Secular tribunals were terrible, and especially in the Protestant world, they would just take you, burn you at the stake, right? There's no comparison with the level of civilization still at the end of the Middle Ages, of probably the Catholic world, that was largely, in fact, the post-Roman one as well, in terms of these other places. And naturally, in all this, what happened. Here we skipped, the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses, but essentially the Tudors emerge as, also stemming from the earlier Plantagenet house, the various branches that had clashed against one another. The Wars of the Roses had providentially for the Tudors decimated the House of Lords, so this allowed for great political concentration. But essentially, the defeat in the 100 Years' War had brought not just to the Wars of the Roses, but in the sense to an internal to a shrinking, essentially, to a fundamentally British dimension. Calais was lost later on under Mary, but let's say in general, England was severed largely from most of the developments occurring in the continent at this point. The ancien regime crystallized in many ways, partially, as we said here, also like this, because without an autonomous church, you have much less control of the same monarchy in a mitigating factor, so that if you're a big fan of the Magna Carta, that was probably not also, again, in absolute terms, the best thing that was happening to England at the time. You should be able to see how deleterious in general the English Reformation really was. Aside from for all what was, these centers were stripped, the absence even properly of monasteries, even as a cultural element, etc. Aside from the decline that in the later Middle Ages they had undergone, etc., it's something irreparable, really, and that radically impacts local culture. And frankly, you have to understand Henry VIII as well, because behind these choices there were pretty consistent sort of so-called realpolitik reasons, right? That doesn't make what happened justifiable, but you have at least to understand the fact that England was in fact lagging behind the continent in many ways. By the time of Henry, things were still working, but the chronic shortage of money was primary hallmark for all powers, and increasingly so in the Renaissance, exactly because England could not quite compete in the same ways against its continental opponents. And the vastity of the royal acquisition of ecclesiastical property is effectively what successfully propels, from a financial point of view, the English monarchy up to the Stuarts, right? The last had been spent by Elizabeth, that also was not really very much of a fervent Protestant. As a matter of fact, it's been hypothesized she was a crypto-Catholic, and and you have to understand, in fact, these sovereigns being much more traditional than we think, much more conservative than we think, but being sort of quote-unquote forced by, it was their fault in any case, to take the easier but worse route, just to to content here the process of modernity, so in its anti-traditional aspects. You have to admire the Stuarts, as a matter of fact, aside from their actual crypto-Catholicism, for trying to make finally England work in a self-sufficient sense with proper taxation and a proper army, which is also what naturally will lead to one of them being beheaded. But paradoxically, by the end of the 17th century, as we will see now, England to become a real, once again, a great power by literally decuplicating military expenses from the time of the ship money, which is also kind of ridiculous, given that in this sense the monarchy had now become something relatively symbolic compared to the parliament, exactly because the latter had not granted the ship money in the beginning and lots of other things naturally. So we will come back on the Stuarts. We have technically still an English Civil War series that we have to finish. But this is just for pointing out how many specificities, like some particular dynamics we have to appreciate in the picture. You have obviously a English Catholic resistance to the Reformation. Manifestations of opposition, notably the Northern Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, sought to restore monastic houses and traditional practices. Yet they encountered crushing military suppression and subsequent executions. This widespread rising in Yorkshire and beyond, led by Robert Aske and involving up to 50,000 participants protesting the dissolution and broader reforms, was crushed with promises of pardon later broken. The minority reign of Edward VI, directed by Protestant advisors and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, propelled the Church towards a more pronounced alignment with continental Reformed positions through the authorization of the Book of Common Prayer, which replaced the Latin rites with an English liturgy that reflected shifts in Eucharistic theology, and the issuance of the 42 Articles, which explicitly disavowed the sacrificial understanding of the Mass, and allied Catholic emphasis while advancing justification by faith, right? So we're not going to comment on this, but I think that you have a pretty concrete idea what it meant. The accession of Mary I in 1553 inaugurated the reversal of these innovations, reinstating links with Rome by means of the Second Statute of Repeal and the labors of Cardinal Reginald Pole, who presided over the reconciliation and the re-establishment of traditional liturgy and doctrine. The restoration of accustomed forms of worship and belief ensued across parishes, with images, vestments, and processions returning to prominence, although the judicial burning of approximately 280 individuals adjudged heretical, encompassing leading reformers tried under revived medieval statutes, imprinted a contentious legacy upon subsequent Protestant historiography and complicated efforts to portray the regime as purely restorative. So all these dynamics actually have some specific reasons. Today we can't quite simply digress on it. We're not here even just to be too judgmental about it. But they're indeed incredibly dramatic and underscore like a deep crisis occurring in early modern spirituality in England. Pole, as papal legate and later Archbishop of Canterbury, oversaw this Marian restoration, including a legatine synod for reform, though the executions fueled later the, quote, Bloody Mary narratives. Elizabeth I's religious settlement, implemented between 1558 and 1559, reaffirmed the monarch's title as supreme governor rather than supreme head, softened certain sensitivities. I mean, Elizabeth was sensible, if anything, herself, sanctioned a modestly amended edition of the prayer book that retained elements capable of broader interpretation, and promulgated the 39 Articles, thereby delineating a middle course that conserved episcopal polity, for example, and select ceremonial elements while incorporating substantial Reformed doctrinal content that emphasize scripture and preaching. And this is also why, by the way, the Anglican Church does retain a big deal sort of Catholic elements within it still today. Adherents who declined participation in the services of the established church, designated recusants under the Recusancy Acts that imposed cumulative fines for non-attendance, confronted a graduated schedule of sanctions codified in successive statutes, recurrent monetary penalties that could precipitate insolvency for wealthier families, periods of incarceration for persistent offenders, forfeiture or sequestration of estates, and limitations upon travel, schooling abroad, and succession to property that restricted Catholic participation in public life. Following the promulgation in 1570 of Pope Pius V's bull that excommunicated Elizabeth and released her Catholic subjects from obligations of obedience, state policy increasingly conflated public profession of Catholicism with latent disloyalty, particularly against the backdrop of conspiracies, the arrival of missionary priests, and the specter of foreign invasion from Catholic powers as well. We have still to finish, among others, the series on the Armada. Priests educated at overseas seminaries located at Douai, Rome, Valladolid, and Seville infiltrated the country clandestinely to nurture isolated communities, frequently harbored within the residences of sympathetic gentry who risked severe penalties, as we've seen. A considerable proportion, including Edmund Campion and Robert Southwell, perished upon the scaffold under statutes that criminalized their very presence within the kingdom as high treason, with executions often preceded by interrogation and attempts at recantation. Campion, a Jesuit known as the Diamond of England, was captured after his brag defending the faith and executed in 1581. Lay believers, among them Margaret Clitheroe, who endured pressing to death in York in 1586 for the offense of harboring priests and refusing to plead, and Anne Lyne, hanged in 1601 for similar acts of charity toward the underground church, shared equivalent fates that underscored the personal cost of fidelity to Rome. The cohort, recognized as the 40 martyrs of England and Wales, encompassing executions from the Carthusian priors who repudiated the supremacy legislation, for example in 1535, through to victims ensnared in the contrived popish plot of 1678-1679, and comprising both clerics and laity, drawn from varied social strata including priests, teachers, and householders, received collective canonization in 1970 as emblematic confessors of the faith whose witness spanned the Henrician, Elizabethan, and later Stuart periods. Their number included figures such as John Houghton, Cuthbert Maine, and Philip Howard, whose steadfastness amid show trials and public executions became a source of inspiration for subsequent generations. The endurance of recusant Catholicism hinged in significant measure upon networks of interlinked aristocratic and gentle families, including branches of the Howards, the Peters, and the Wells, who maintained discreet oratories often disguised as libraries or private chambers, retained Catholic domestic servants, and extended protection to missionary clergy, notwithstanding the cumulative burden of fines, social ostracism, and the necessity of outward conformity in certain public spheres. In strongholds such as rural Lancashire and parts of the north, where recusancy retained demographic density through the 17th and into the 18th century, familial alliances and local loyalties perpetuated sacramental observance, the devotional routines, and the transmission of faith to children despite legal prohibition, Catholic education, and inheritance. I would like to stress how important this dynamic is when you also see it in the backdrop of an international struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism. right? We could make broader considerations, I hope, again, to expand soon on properly religious history of early modern Europe that we covered only in a military sense so far. There is also an interesting dynamic because, of course, like these Catholics had connections with foreigners and in some cases properly enemies of England. Not only though, and this is also important in a sense, because there were Catholic countries that, yes, did not like what the English were doing very much, but not were overt enemies. As such, there were even sympathies, for example, towards Venice in England, notoriously enough, also because it sort of prevented the Inquisition from operating in its lands. That there were honorary Protestants, also for telling you how superficial the theological concepts had somehow become like, in this border struggle. What you see within England is also the fact that the least developed parts of England, so exactly the ones that is historically resisted Christianity, now were paradoxically resisting Protestantism. You can argue that there were some broader reasons why Protestantism had won, especially in the south of England. But this should be understood, again, only on an international background, because without that, like, you would measure through England just like the measure of a religion, and that's not quite what was happening anymore. Like at the time of late antiquity, you can measure that as a tidal wave without confessional sort of fraction. At this point, the world is very different. So even though surely there are some elements of Protestantism, at least if you look at the English civilization and how it boomed, and you can argue that indeed the papal monarchy had maintained a control over some countries, preventing from in this sense, like they're preventing their monarchies from sort of exploiting their own initial drive that, however, could not last without properly a unified Christian and, in this sense, truly Catholic and imperial world, right? And so, while there is a positivity in that, I mean, when you look at Cromwell, carrying out the massacre of Drogheda, like you can't say, I don't know, the Irish were sort of the push of civilization in that moment, right? So we'll come back to that. So never make the mistake of simply taking this sort of confessional divides and also just projecting them as something that never changed historically, meaning that even today, like, the standards of a Protestant, say of an Anglican in this case, today is very different from the one of the 16th century, but also very different from the one of the 18th century. And so, as such, again, it's the same thing that we were saying before about the concepts of monotheism or polytheism. These are modern distortions. They have nothing to do with actual categories in, let's say, better in spiritual understanding of the world. And so, also here you can find the reasons of an Anglican church that still existed, obviously, and of, in this sense, a monarchy that controlled it. But at the same time, you want to appreciate that those Northern English Catholics, those recusants, were not alone in their Catholic faith at this point in history. Still, the most advanced part of Europe was Catholic, right? And even today, the divide actually is minimal. I think Protestant Europe is something like, 6% more advanced overall than Catholic one. So I will not digress on how we perceive today and where in particular Catholicism, Protestantism, but always remember that there is a specifically modernistic and secularistic indiscriminate amplification, a plain butchery of spiritual, religious, historical concepts that you can easily, again, extend also to our understanding, again, of quote-unquote paganism, or even the affirmation of Christianity itself. Like, that people today, even though they're raised in a culturally Christian world, have literally no clue of, right? This could be easily extended. I don't know, like, not even Muslims have a minimal clue about the age of Muhammad in a historical perspective. But it's still, again, in fact, more of a problem in general for everyone. Now, the tradition, as you know, navigated the Stuart interval with the intermittent courtly forbearance, notably during the influence of Henrietta Maria as consort to Charles I, which allowed limited Catholic presence at court, and the circulation of continental devotional influences, yet encountered intensified constraints in the aftermath of the 1688 revolution. I'm making everything very simply here. But just imagine, just for explaining, the true Catholic tradition of Old England, the English at some point in their history historiographically denied to have had a revolution because they didn't want to be associated to what had happened in France, right? So if the power of historiography, especially of such a developed country like England at that point, would be able to properly remove these ideas, you can imagine how even more arcane the entire discourse surrounding Catholicism can be in the same lens, right? How much more aware of the world we should become. You have also the provisions of the Act of Settlement that permanently disqualified Catholics from succession to the throne, among other things, because that had been a great point of contention during the Civil War and the Restoration, etc., while reinforcing broader disabilities as well. Governance of the dispersed faithful passed to apostolic vicariates instituted from 1685, which provided titular oversight through bishops operating without full diocesan structures until the reconstitution of the hierarchy in 1850. Amid growing toleration at that point, it's paradoxically that happened because the same Protestant faith sort of loosened its grip in a broader modernizing sense, not much because there was a reinvigoration of spiritual strength. This is true, again, for the 19th century in general. This is not England in particular. I don't want to make this video making you pass any idea that I'm criticizing in this sense in a broader way the caliber of English civilization, and also because, especially as you see in this video, of the still Catholic legacy that lived within it. While incremental legislative relief materialized through the Catholic Relief Acts of 1778 and 1791, which, contingent upon oaths of allegiance to the Protestant succession, permitted property acquisition, the conduct of Catholic schooling, and public celebration of worship, paving the way for comprehensive emancipation enacted in 1829, that dismantled the preponderance of remaining civic impediments and enabled the open profession and practice of the faith on a scale unseen since the pre-Reformation era. The 1829 Act, driven by Irish pressures and figures like Daniel O'Connell, allowed Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold most offices, following earlier relief that eased property and worship restrictions. This is very interesting for a number of reasons. Also consider Irish immigration in the United States as an English offshoot at this point, for example. Now, this persistent filament of fidelity to the Roman pontiff, inaugurated with the Gregorian mission of Augustine and tempered through eras of political rupture, legal prescription, communal resilience, and eventual legislative accommodation, forms thus this essential continuity of the English Catholic tradition upheld by successive generations of clergy and laity who, amid sweeping national metamorphosis from the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms through the upheavals of the Tudor and Stuart centuries, upheld the imperative visible unity with the universal church centered upon the See of Peter while adapting to the particular conditions of English society and law. Thus, as I was saying at the beginning, besides wishing you obviously the most lovely Easter, I really mean it in a deeply heartfelt way, including to my Protestant followers. For the Orthodox, we have to wait another week, but that's another point. And you see, even in what I just said, you understand the commonality that exists in a broader tradition and in the root, in any case, of all Protestant cultures from properly the Catholic one. This can't be denied today. I wanted to start, actually, when I was thinking to make this video from quite a while, and as I was hinting at the beginning, one could even extend the idea of a Catholic tradition to, obviously, the pre-Christian world, pretty much everywhere, not just to Britain, not just to England. But, and that is something perhaps we will see better in another video, looking at the Roman government rather than conquest of Britain. I have yet lots of British series that I have to finish. We have probably the last episodes, and then we will naturally dive even more in depth for those. But the idea that Britain had belonged to a great imperial Catholic power, like Romanity in England, is something that we tend not to appreciate, exactly because we make the simple equation of, aside from the idea of the Dark Ages, the sort of all a sense of detachment, of particularism of England. And this is obviously true, also, especially just the fact that you live in an island. It's, I don't believe in geopolitics, as you know, but the question is, it does have an impact. It is important. It can impress you, especially when such boundaries become the same boundaries of a proper people as a whole, right? Could you speak of a people like the Britons per se? Well, probably by some extent, yes. I mean, before the Roman conquest, for example, but there would have been, in many cases, actually much more consistent Belgian identity. But the fact that, in fact, Rome conquers Britain, and that Christianity is not in this sense simply a peregrine fashion, but is technically what becomes the religion of the empire, and an empire that had already been Catholic, seems to me, in its truly Roman Catholic sense, both pre-Christianly and Christianly speaking, one of the single most underrated bridges, right, that between not just the ancient and medieval world, that is definitely important to point out as such, but also between Britain and the continent. So a truly European tradition of Catholic ecumenic rule from Rome, even more importantly, in absolute terms. Naturally, as we were just hinting at in these last reflections in this video, when you look at what would happen like in modernity in general, and how, for example, indeed, the dominant Anglo-American worldview that informed so many other countries, think about India, think about sort of ourselves, even as continental Europeans, you can look at Southern America, our entire sense of history is sort of very much impressed by that. Like, we have inherited, at least in a pop cultural sense, the idea that there is simply a matter of fracture, that sort of we should be celebrating separation or sort of individual and in this sense detached, decontextualized characteristics without any observance of the universal meaning of tradition. Like, one of the first indicators that one is probably not acquainted with the entire concept of Catholicism is the fact that whenever you talk about this, they think that there is any dichotomic opposition in outside of being, not being, being, becoming, etc., is completely oblivious of the double thread that ties, in fact, necessarily heaven with earth, right? It's a concept, as I said before, that even, in a Catholic sense, the Anglo-Saxon had, like the concept of Midgard, and so the dimension of rule of a world entirely had to be brought under a single rule that could elevate the same oikoumene to heaven, right? Starts also from individual differences. So individual differences are not obliterated by Catholicism. If anyone has ever believed this and exchanges this type of content for quote-unquote globalism or whatever, like, it's pretty pretty distant, to be euphemistic, from some deeper sort of theological history, sort of metaphysical concepts in the most original sources of the very same peoples, like the Age of Order, as expressed by the Romans, and true, again, we can make the same comparison in parallel during the same centuries for what we understand from Germanic mythology of the time, also thanks also to later history, of course, is something that already entailed an ecumenic scale, right? And only those who fail in creating an ecumenic dominion insist in the fracturing of the same, right? And so when you think of of Catholic tradition proper, you can't but understand that its relevance lays exactly in the capacity to replicate this order and this power, right? So I could make a list here, almost like cahier de doléances, of all the misconceptions that occur when you want to dichotomize history always from your own side and taking every kind of customization, personalization as, it's mine, so it has to be good or it has to work. That's a form of narcissism, fundamentally, and it can't be maintained in any serious historical sense by matter of morals. It's not even science per se or method, or it's just a matter of honesty and a matter of objectivity. So history obviously went the way it did, so we shouldn't use these conclusions even to say, okay, well, those who went astray are simply lost or bad or negative, or well, look at what is happening even to Britain nowadays. Unfortunately, these are, again, it's always double-threaded, as I said before, so you can never sort of separate the two things. You can never disjunct them from their past. They're never random. They're never somebody else's fault, right? They're always your fault in any case. But that's exactly the key to empowerment. That's exactly the key to actual power and establishment of Catholic power, of tradition. And so these are contentious topics today because it seems to me that, in fact, we lack, just for traditional awareness in any case, any realistic spiritual, cultural awareness that can allow us to recover those values in order to enact actual tradition, right? And there are, in my experience, what literally opened my eyes about all this, because definitely, not even when I started Schwerpunkt, even though in embryo I had much of this already pretty clearly laid out, I had not realized, in fact, mostly the scale of this. I had never realized the actual ease when properly confronted on a regular basis with history and history and history and history repeatedly. How concrete, how measurable these concepts really are, right? We live in a civilization of background noise. And so confusion becomes normality. And so dispirited is the normal condition, really. Catholicism opens up, even in a pre-Christian. This is what I always say. I consider myself a Catholic before a Christian, right? In order of importance, then you can argue I never really open up myself on my specific spirituality. Naturally, you get most of this from my work in general, but religion is something else. And I never actually come up with things like, I'm a Christian. I never really actually even stated this even once. I'm baptized, I'm a Christian conventionally. I definitely attended church. I haven't, I have a very heavily cultural Christian profile. But and I interrogate myself constantly on this, it never stops, right? And it's a path. It's a form of inner work. It takes a lot, and it does bring results. And Catholicism prepotently emerges from the mists of history once light clarifies them, right? And I will not add more than much to this, because I consider myself also just as a medium. I limit myself to expose what naturally emerges from this. And I would say in particular, last time I was in England, I was 14, and actually toured Scotland on that occasion. But in any case, I took my plane back home from England, from Newcastle, and I visited also some other things around in England proper. But the question is, I've actually have an enormous love for England. And there is in Britain in general, like Anglo-American culture, the entire Anglosphere, so to say. This doesn't happen very much out there, but it emerged as an aspect in my work. Let's say you tend to divide very much while trying to unite, apparently, in this sort of, there's an idea of an insular world and a continental world. The purpose is to unite, and the purpose is to admire, right? I don't have beautiful words to put together to express the magnitude of admiration and love that I have for English culture, given that we're talking about this here in particular today. But I really hope that through these videos it transpires, and that it, in this sense, expands to any possible field reached by Englishness in a way. I don't really... There is something, again, that deeply elicits, like something unspeakable in terms of the balance that Old English culture, identity, language, and more, and including in the pre-Christian tradition, has in order and continue living through properly the Christian one, even through Protestantism, not just through Catholic England, is beautifully calibrated for the recovery of traditional understanding. And much of Western accomplishments do derive from that as well in the modern era. From the modern starting, so this was always contributing, but in general, like, there were different countries at different times having a preeminence in this. And so I hope that as we're continuing also our series on English history, I have definitely more than some video at this point. How much about English history? This is the 99th video, ironically. And we'll get for that 100 at some point with some greater humility for that touch of providence, right? But it's definitely a tribe that I imperfectly lay down to a higher divine domain that I hope, like this compositive process of history, like a great mosaic of a truly Catholic power, can help coming closer to the same divinity. And so, as Easter today, I really wish you, again, the most beautiful possible moments. Like, when you're a kid, it's more about Christmas. In the last years, I've sort of had a disproportionately large inclination for Easter, and I feel this quite deeply. So I really wish you any possible good. I wish you to rejoice. I don't need to remember what is that we're celebrating, and what the deeper meaning of that it really is, not just in a literal Christian sense, but in a Catholic sense. But if you're aware of that, you know why there's no such thing like death, but in our fears. And this is what I think has kept us alive and dominant for such a long time. And this is the way to the top. for today, however, stop it here. I will not say the whole thing. I just wish you again a splendid Easter with your loved ones, as well as, in general, with your loved ones, and whatever you're doing at this point, if you're traveling or not, or whatever. I just hope you're having a great time. As always, also thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Happy Easter.